Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Muddy York podcast. And today, you're in for a treat because we're kicking off part one in a new recurring series we're calling When Toronto Tore Down the Fancy Stuff. A deep dive into the beautiful, bold, and totally doomed buildings this city once had, and then promptly erased. We're not really sure yet how many of these will do, but the city has gotten rid of some pretty great buildings over the years, either on purpose or by accident, or for seemingly no reason at all.
If there's one thing Toronto's always been good at, it's building something fancy and then destroying it before anyone got too attached.
In this first episode, we'll focus on the years 1800 to 1920, when Toronto, still figuring out how not to sink in the mud, started dreaming big. Opera houses, glass palaces, Gothic hotels, massive mansions.
We'll talk about Moss Park with its futuristic for the time plumbing setup, the Crystal Palace, which looked like a spaceship made of windows, Hanlan's Hotel, our little Victorian beach party zone, and of course Government House, where the province said, wait, this is how much to eat?
If we can get to it in this episode, we'll also dig into the Grand Opera House, St. James Cathedral, pre-fire, the Lost Wings of St. Lawrence Hall, the OG Normal School, and yes, both attempts at the Parliament buildings. You'll laugh, you'll cry, you'll wonder, how many times can one city set itself on fire?
If you heard our episode about the Great Fire of 1849 and our future episode about the Great Fire of 1904, the answer would definitely be 2, but I think Gray was being a bit more metaphorical in this sense, so buckle up, we're heading into the age of grandeur and the wrecking balls that followed. From marble columns to stained glass windows, now replaced by condos, parking lots, and the occasional food court. I'm Adam Weiser.
And I'm Grayson Miller, and this is Muddy York. Let's start with Moss Park, the original flex pad of William Allen, one of Toronto's earliest one-percenters. The skyline was still low, the ambition was sky high, and Allen was right at the top of the heap. He wasn't just rich, he was the establishment. Banker, postmaster, militia officer, and a key player in the family compact, Toronto's founding power clique. Naturally, he needed a home that said, I run this town. So, in 1827, William Allen built his Moss Park estate, a sprawling Greek revival mansion on 100 acres of land. Situated on the west side of Sherbourne Street between Queen and Shooter Streets, the estate featured red brick construction, towering white columns, and all the hallmarks of neoclassical grandeur. The construction back then cost £3,248, which was a big sum of money, and Allen spent the equivalent amount, again, on lavish upgrades and furnishings. Because when you've got more money than distractions, you just build more house.
And this wasn't just a nice house, it was a statement. By 1841, Allen had hot and cold running water, a full bath, in a city where many people were still bathing in Lake Ontario or using the bucket and sponge method. The property had orchards, manicured gardens, and 2 curved streets named Wilton and Wellesley Crescents, which Allen himself laid out. We'll post a photo from 1897 in our socials. You'll see the mansion in all of its glory. Tall columns, stately brick, the kind of house that practically whispers, don't touch anything.
William Allen was old Toronto high society, but here's the heartbreaking part. He and his wife, Leah, had 10 kids. Only one survived to adulthood. 8 of them died in one horrific winter, 1831 to 1832. They were taken by scarlet fever, whooping cough, and whatever else the 19th century could throw at you. Their one surviving son, George William Allen, inherited the estate and kept the legacy going. By the mid-1800s, Moss Park was like its own little kingdom in the city. George even donated a slice of land to the city that became Allen Gardens. Not the most inspired name, but hey, it stuck.
In Toronto, if it's worth preserving, odds are it won't be. As the city grew rapidly in the late 1800s, grand old estates like Moss Park were slowly chopped up and sold off. George Allen started dividing the land in the 1850s, turning pieces of the estate into housing lots. The mansion itself stuck around a while longer. George lived there until his death in 1901, and his widow stayed on for a couple more years after that. But by 1903, the writing was on the wall. The city took ownership of a massive, historic, but unfortunately now fairly run-down home. They decided it was more trouble than it was worth, and by 1905, Moss Park was gone.
And now, Moss Park is just a name. There's the armory and the public housing complex that share the name, but the actual mansion, long gone. It's hard not to think of the irony. What used to be a literal estate of power and privilege is now a military warehouse and one of the city's most underserved communities.
I feel like there's a message in there about the fleeting nature of wealth. Imagine being the wealthiest man in Upper Canada. You build a Greek temple to your own greatness, and a few decades later, the city bulldozes it like nothing happened. That's Toronto. Build it, love it, knock it down, and move on. Now, to be fair, George Allen did leave us Allen Gardens, and that domed conservatory is still standing somehow. A little miracle of glass and iron in a city that tends to treat beauty as a temporary condition. But the fall of Moss Park, that was a warning shot. If even that couldn't survive, what could?
Well, how about a building made entirely of glass and iron?
Gray is talking about Crystal Palace, which was built in 1858 and officially named the Palace of Industry, which feels like a bit of an Orwellian name. It was the crown jewel of the Provincial Agricultural Exhibition of Canada West. It stood just northwest of King and Shaw Streets and was Toronto's first permanent exhibition hall. Think of it as the city's original convention center, but made of glass and iron and designed to show off. The design was inspired by London's famed Crystal Palace and brought to life by Sanford Fleming, yes, the time zones guy, and Collingwood Schreiber. They kept the overall look of the original building, but reinforced it with more iron to handle Canadian winters. The result was massive and gleaming, although not everyone was impressed. One critic called it very low, as if crushed down by the superincumbent massive roof. Not exactly glowing praise from this guy, but hey, it stood.
The big debut of Crystal Palace happened on September 28, 1858, with the Governor General in attendance and a bishop there to bless the building. Because if you're going to house pigs, plows, and machinery in a giant glass temple, you might as well bring in some divine insurance. The first headline event? The Provincial Agricultural and Industrial Exhibition. Think of it as a 19th century mashup of a trade show, a county fair, and a science expo. There were prize-winning pigs, cutting-edge farm equipment, and even Catherine Parr Trail showing off a collection of pressed native plants.
But the Crystal Palace wasn't just about livestock and lupines. In 1860, it hosted the Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VII, during his royal tour. In 1870, it doubled as a military barracks, housing troops on their way to the Red River Rebellion. So yes, it toggled casually between garden showcase and pop-up army base. By the 1870s, it was starting to feel small. Toronto was growing fast and the palace, while still shiny, couldn't keep up with the crowds. So in 1878, the city made a big call. They decided to move the whole thing, and yes, we mean literally move it. They dismantled it piece by piece, picked up the iron and glass, and reassembled it at what's now Exhibition Place. At the time, it was just an empty patch of Fort York's military reserve. Toronto did recycling before it was cool.
The rebooted Crystal Palace opened in 1879 with a second floor, skylights, and a central tower topped by a cupola. Basically, Crystal Palace version 2.0. It got rave reviews. One paper said it was large enough to accommodate the inhabitants of an ordinary township. Another visitor, and what we'll call very casual 1870s lingo, said the building ain't no slouch. which honestly might be the best architectural review ever published. The Crystal Palace became the heart of the Toronto Industrial Exhibition, later rebranded the Canadian National Exhibition. As the CNE rose to prominence, the Crystal Palace was rebranded as the Center for Transportation, which showcased all the latest marvels of the transportation world. Unfortunately, one afternoon, embers started and the Crystal Palace caught fire.
What followed was described as both spectacular and horrifying. The fire lit up the sky. Panes of glass exploded one by one. Flames tore through the wood framing, and onlookers said the entire building glowed, with every window outlined in fire. The Mail and Empire reported that the iron supports looked like giant arms stretched imploringly to the scarlet sky, and another account in the Toronto Star described how the flames blazed merrily through the galleries, casting reflections off the lake and drawing crowds who watched in silence as the city's once grand showpiece collapsed in a shower of sparks.
By 11:30 p.m., the palace was a smoldering skeleton. Some suspected arson. There had been a few strange incidences earlier in the day that raised eyebrows, but nothing was ever proven. Maybe glass palaces just have a built-in self-destruct feature. London's Crystal Palace burned down. So did New York's. It's like the universe takes one look at these buildings and says, "Too pretty. Burn it." The loss was huge. By 1907, a new horticultural building was put up on the same site. It was nice, but it wasn't the same. The age of glass palaces, that strange mix of industry, wonder, and ambition, was over. Today, all that remains are a few faded photographs, some forgotten postcards, and a whole lot of ash buried beneath Exhibition Place. We'll post some of those photos on our socials. Seeing the scale and beauty of the Crystal Palace makes the loss hit even harder. The moral: if you're going to build your civic dreams out of wood and glass, maybe think twice. Still, for nearly 50 years, Toronto had a Crystal Palace, a place where people came to marvel at innovation, art, and industry. It stood for Victorian optimism, for civic pride, for the idea that beauty and progress could share the same space. And then it stood for something else entirely: how fast all of that can go up in flames. The Palace of Industry produced a lot over the years, but what it left behind was one unforgettable fire.
From flaming glass to seaside wood, next we set our sights on the Toronto Islands, specifically Hanlan's Point, where Hotel Hanlan once stood as the glittering heart of the city's own Coney Island-style amusement park. If you've been with us for a while, you might remember our full episode on the islands where Hanlan's Hotel made a brief cameo. If not, feel free to circle back and give it a listen. But today, we're diving deeper into this beachfront getaway turned historical footnote. Because if you think a luxury hotel on a golden stretch of sand could survive in Toronto, you clearly haven't been paying attention.
Hey everyone, get in this boat with me and let's take a figurative row across the harbor to Hanlan's Point. Back in the late 1800s, this was Toronto's playground. Beaches, baseball, bandstands, carousels. And at the center of all of this was Hotel Hanlan, sometimes called Hanlan's Hotel, the grand dame of island life. If you've ever taken the ferry to Hanlan's Point, you've landed on what was once Canada's answer to Coney Island. Yes, before it became the city's most famously clothing-optional beach, Hanlan's was a full-blown amusement zone. Though honestly, given the state of Victorian wool swimsuits, I kind of know why clothing eventually became optional.
The Hanlan family were early settlers on the islands. John Hanlan moved there in 1862 and quickly realized he could turn sand into gold. In 1878, he converted his family cottage into a modest hotel. 2 years later, he replaced it with something more ambitious: a whimsical Second Empire-style building with mansard roofs, dormer windows, and sweeping verandas. I actually don't know what half of those words mean, but they sound very impressive. It looked like a midi French chateau dropped beside the lake. Again, we'll post a photo from the 1890s on our socials. You'll see the Hotel Hanlan sign hanging proudly, with guests lounging on the veranda like they had nowhere better to be. And for a long time, there really wasn't a better place to be.
The hotel's wraparound veranda faced the water with stunning views of the city skyline across the bay. By the 1800s, it was the centerpiece of Hanlan's Point amusement park, which had everything. There was a roller coaster called the Figure Eight, a carousel, dancing pavilion, bandstand, game booths, and even a Japanese tea garden. Depending on how much you trust the 19th century advertising, there may have also been a freak show. Oh, and a 40-foot diving tower for horses. Yes, we talked about this before, but I bring it up because I still think it's so insane. They used horses, they put them up on a 40-foot diving board, and they launched the horses off the diving board, the horses neighing all the way to the bottom of the water. It was probably horrifying. This was crazy Victorian entertainment.
The Hanlan name only grew in stature. John's son, Edward Ned Hanlan, became a global rowing champion and a sports legend in his day. And I just want to stop to hammer home that point. Rowing isn't a big deal these days. We might watch it at the Olympics, but it was a full-blown fad at the end of the 19th century. And Ned Hanlan was a sporting superstar. It's hard to say how big he was, and he will definitely get his own episode at some point. But he also took over the family business. And after winning big on the world stage, he poured a lot of that prize money, which was substantial, back into the hotel, as well as the park, upgrading both. By the 1890s, Hanlan's Point was the summer destination. Tourists packed ferries to escape the city heat, and at night, the hotel's gaslights twinkled across the bay. There was a ballroom, there were parties. You can imagine sing-alongs, flirtations, maybe the occasional scandalous midnight swim. It's all very Downton Abbey. This place had a vibe.
On August 10th, 1909, a fire broke out at Hanlan's Point. It spread quickly. Within hours, Hotel Hanlan, the amusement park, and even the nearby wooden baseball stadium were completely gone. The flames were so intense they lit up the skyline. People on the mainland stood on the waterfront watching the island burn, the sky glowing orange behind the city. The timing couldn't have been worse. It was the height of summer, and the hotel was likely full. Thankfully, there are no records of any fatalities. The fire probably started late at night after most guests had left for the day. But the damage? Catastrophic. $200,000 lost, and in 1909, that was an enormous sum.
They rebuilt parts of the amusement park the following year, including a new concrete baseball stadium, but Hotel Hanlan was never replaced. That blackened patch of ground was left empty, and slowly the crowd stopped coming. By the 1920s, the action had shifted to Sunnyside Park on the mainland, which was easier to get to by car or streetcar. Hanlan's Point had faded. Then, in the 1930s, the city cleared out what was left to make way for the island airport, now Billy Bishop. So next time you fly Porter, just know that you're taxiing on the site of a hotel that wants to find summer in Toronto.
The legacy of Hotel Hanlan lives on in name only. On the beach, in a few surviving photos, and in the statue of Ned Hanlan himself, oar in hand, forever watching over the water where his hotel used to be. He was a man who rode the world, built a family empire, and watched it all go up in smoke.
It's a tale of big dreams on a sandbar and how quickly dreams can burn.
All right, guys, get back in the boat with me, and we're going from the ashes of a beachside hotel to the velvet halls of political power. We're rowing back to the mainland now, straight into the heart of 19th century prestige. Next stop, Government House, a residence so refined, so stately, that Rosedale matrons reportedly wept when it came down.
Ah yes, Government House. Not to be confused with the present-day Lieutenant Governor's office at Queen's Park, which is just that, an office. We're talking about the real thing. The grand official residence where the Lieutenant Governor actually lived in full vice-regal style. There were a few government houses over the years, but the one that really turned heads was the third. Built in 1870, it stood at King and Simcoe and was easily the most opulent.
And this place had all the trimmings: a grand carriage porch, a central tower, cavernous drawing rooms on the ground floor, and a state bedroom upstairs with sweeping views of Lake Ontario. As far as lodging goes, this is as nice as it gets in Ontario. It was just enough glamour to make the lieutenant governor feel important, and just enough distance from the working class to keep things comfortably out of touch. Elegant, exclusive, and completely unsustainable, which in this city is basically a demolition notice waiting to happen. It's the kind of place where you could imagine Sir John A. Macdonald sipping brandy in the parlor, and honestly, he probably did. The construction costs came in around $105,000, which in 1870, I don't need to tell you, is a massive sum. And yes, Ontario taxpayers picked up the bill, because nothing says responsible government like building a mini Versailles for Queen Victoria's stand-in. The first residence was John Beverley Robinson. Over the next 4 decades, a rotating cast of vice-regal appointees lived there, hosting balls, levees, and all kind of high society hobnobbing. We're talking gloves, titles, and the right kind of sherry. One imagines the dining room conversation went something like this: "Shall we invest in public health, or get another chandelier? Pass the port, would you?" Ha 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 ha.
By all accounts, it was one of the most lavish residences in the country. A contemporary might have called it the finest mansion in Canada. That is, until Shorley Park showed up in 1915, but we'll get to that mess later. Here's the irony. The building that once screamed power and prestige eventually got a little too close to the city's grime. As rail yards and factories crept in, the area lost its glow. The same elites who once demanded luxury in the heart of Toronto started whispering about Rosedale and peace and quiet. It's a classic Toronto move. Build something beautiful, then decide the neighborhood isn't worthy of it.
In 1912, the province sold the property to Canadian Pacific Railway. Yes, the railroad barons. The mansion was quickly marked for demolition. The lieutenant governor packed up and moved into a temporary spot, and not long after, into Shorley Park. By 1915, the red brick palace at King and Simcoe was gone, flattened for progress, or maybe just for profit. One newspaper later called it an astonishingly opulent mansion, which somehow makes the loss sting a little bit more. It had stood for less than 50 years. Today, the site is home to train tracks, Roy Thompson Hall, and the Ritz-Carlton. Walk by Simcoe and King now, and you never guessed there was once a vice-regal palace wrapped in gardens right there. Again, we'll post some more photos on our socials, so take a look. But trust me, when Government House came down, it definitely left a mark on the city.
Even back then, people were upset. The demolition sparked a backlash, and critics said Toronto was too quick to trade beauty for business. Sure, the province saved money on upkeep, but it lost the landmark. And what did we learn from that? We built Shorley Park, an even fancier French chateau-style government house in Rosedale. It opened in 1915. By 1937, it was labeled too expensive. By 1961, it was gone. Maybe the lesson isn't that Toronto tears things down. Maybe it's that permanence was never really the point. For a few decades, these buildings gave us pageantry, prestige, and a glimpse of something grander. And then the city moved on, as it always does.
Today, Toronto has no official government house, which might actually be for the best. It's hard to demolish something that doesn't exist. The legacy of the 1870 residence survives mostly in photographs, archives, and maybe a plaque if you're lucky. There are even ghost stories. Some claimed a secret tunnel once connected the mansion to the waterfront or to Upper Canada College. Probably nonsense, but it shows how the place took on a mythic, almost royal presence in the city's imagination.
In a bittersweet twist, a few pieces of furniture and decor were saved and now sit in museums, but the mansion itself, gone without a trace. At least Shorley Park's grounds were turned into a public park, so something came out of that loss, but the original government house site became railway land, and today, it's just another patch of the entertainment district. And if you partied in Toronto in the late 2000s, you might remember the government. The iconic nightclub, not a government landmark, different spelling, different function, same result, it's gone too. One day, some developer will throw up a condo called the Governor's Residences, glass, steel, and a plaque out front pretending to care. Full circle.
And if you think that was the end of it, oh no. Toronto didn't just stop at mansions and palaces. Coming up next, a rapid-fire round of even more grand buildings the city lovingly built and then enthusiastically destroyed. We're talking the lost wings of St. Lawrence Hall, the second Parliament buildings, the Grand Opera House, Old St. James Cathedral, and the Normal School at St. James Square. It's like a demolition version of Oprah. You get a tear down, you get a tear down, everybody gets a tear down.
I think this is a good place to pause and call it the end of part one. I think Gray's getting a little overexcited about the whole thing.
In part two, we'll dive into the buildings that we just talked about, that were burned down or deliberately destroyed. Okay, there's more fire, there's more demolition, and a whole lot of more questionable decisions by the people Toronto put in charge. So, join us next time for the second half of this episode, and probably like a part two, or maybe even part three, maybe even a part four of when Toronto tore down the fancy stuff. If you've enjoyed this trip through the city's forgotten architecture, please subscribe, leave us a 5-star review, and why don't you shout about this podcast lovingly to a passenger on a streetcar? Tell them about it.
Just as a note, we will not be bailing people out if you get arrested for shouting about the podcast on streetcars. We do appreciate the effort, but honestly, we just don't have the cash. If any of the buildings we mentioned today caught your interest, we've got full episodes that touch on several of them. Check out our episode on the Toronto Islands, where we explore the full rise and fall of Hanlan's Hotel, and our episode on baseball in Toronto, where we talk more about Hanlan's Point Stadium, Babe Ruth, and the city's early love of the game. You can find us on X, we're still calling it Twitter in our hearts, at Toronto_history. You can also follow us. You can also find us on Blue Sky at Muddy York, all one word, and on Facebook at Muddy York History, again, all one word. That's a whole lot of websites and a whole lot of words, but we hope you subscribe. In addition to the episodes, we get bonus facts, we repost about other history events, and we have a running on this day, because some days in Toronto had lots of exciting events, and others are, quite honestly, a bit of a stretch on my part.
Oh my gosh, and speaking of stretch, this was a long episode, so take a stretch. I'm going to go for a stretch. Everybody should stretch, and then come back for part two. Bye, guys.